The winter of 1880 did not arrive politely. It came down from Canada in a mass so dense and so still that the old farmers in the Crow Wing Valley said afterward they had never seen anything like it in 40 years of Minnesota winters. The cold did not fluctuate the way cold normally does, easing through the days and dropping again at night. It simply settled, locked in place by a ridge of high pressure that sat over the northern part of the state like a stone placed on top of a jar lid and refused to move. For 9 consecutive days, the temperature outside did not rise above minus 29 degrees Fahrenheit. On the worst of those days, it reached minus 38, and at that depth of cold, the moisture in your exhaled breath did not drift or disperse. It crystallized in the air in front of your face and fell as a faint shimmer of ice barely visible in the gray light, dropping straight down to the snow beneath your feet. 9 people in the valley did not survive that winter. Not because they were careless, not because they were weak, not because they made some obvious error in judgment that a wiser person would have avoided. They died because the cold exceeded every plan they had made, every store of wood and food they had laid, in every margin they thought they had built into the arithmetic of survival. The cold took what it needed and left the rest. Vera Caldwell was not among the 9. She was 39 years old, a widow living alone on 80 acres of land along a tributary of the Crow Wing River. She had no family within 1,000 miles. She had no savings beyond what the land itself could produce. She had a horse named Flint, a mixed dairy cow named Bess, a woodshed her husband had built in their second year on the property, and a hatch cut into the floor of that woodshed beneath the third row of split birch, hidden under the ordinary weight of ordinary wood that no one who had not placed it there would ever have found. What was below that hatch is why she lived when others did not. This is the story of how it got there, and who taught her the idea that made it possible. Her father's name was Owen Caldwell. He was a farmer in central Ohio, a man who built things to last and did not speak much about what he built or why, because to his way of thinking, a thing that worked was its own explanation. He was not a formal teacher. He did not believe in lessons that came with introductions and conclusions and a clear moral delivered at the end. He believed in showing you something and trusting you to file it away until you needed it. He had learned this from his own father, who had learned it from his, and the understanding went back through a chain of men who had worked cold ground in places where winter was not a season you prepared against, but a force you negotiated with. Owen did not romanticize this. He simply respected it. His people had come from a part of Ohio settled before the century turned, and they had built their structures into hillsides and against ridges long before anyone in the region had thought to write down why this worked better than building on open flat ground. The knowledge had never been documented because the people who carried it had never considered it remarkable. It was simply how you built when you understood what the earth was doing beneath you. The first time he took Vera underground, she was 9 years old. It was late October of 1850, and the surface of the ground outside the old storage shed had already begun to stiffen under the first serious frosts of the season. The sky that afternoon had the particular flat white quality that Ohio skies take on in the weeks before the first real snow, a light that seemed to come from inside the clouds rather than behind them. Owen led her down a set of stone steps cut into the earth beneath the shed foundation. The steps were damp and slightly slick, and she held the rough wooden rail with both hands. The air changed with each step she descended. Not suddenly, not all at once, but gradually, the way a room changes when someone opens a door to somewhere warmer. By the time she reached the earthen floor 6 feet below the surface, the temperature had shifted enough that she could feel it on her face the way you feel the presence of a stove before you can actually see it. The sensation startled her. She had expected cold because cold was what October did to everything, but the earth had its own schedule separate from the sky above it, and the schedule it kept was months behind the one her boots walked on every day. This was the first thing the seller taught her before her father said a word that the world underground was operating on a different clock than the world she walked through every morning. The seller held particular things in the fall of 1850: 6 crocks of pickled cabbage sealed with beeswax, a sack of dried apples that carried the smell of September into October, 2 jugs of cider with cloth stoppers pushed into the necks, a row of root vegetables arranged by Owen's hands with the kind of precision a man uses when he understands that what he places here is the difference between eating well and eating barely through March. Vera had helped load it during the week before this visit, making 4 trips down the steep steps with what she could manage each time. She had made more trips than Owen expected of her because she was 9 years old and stubborn enough to insist on doing more than was strictly necessary. She had not understood then why the cellar felt so different from the house or the barn. She understood now, standing with her hand against the stone. Her father was crouching beside the row of wax-sealed crocks. His breath was barely visible in the lamplight. He did not look at her immediately. He placed his right hand flat against the fieldstone wall, palm open, the fingers spread, and held it there. She waited. "The earth remembers summer longer than we do," he said. He pressed his hand harder against the stone as if reading something through his skin. Then he explained. He explained it once completely in the unhurried way he explained anything that mattered. Stone absorbs heat slowly and releases that heat slowly. A stone wall buried 6 feet underground does not cool at the same rate as the air above it when winter comes. It resists, it holds. It gives back the warmth it stored through July and August in small, steady quantities across the weeks of December and January without asking for anything in return. The trick, he said, is position, not just depth. The location must be sheltered from the surface temperature swings that steal heat before the stone can do its work. A roof overhead, even the simple floor of a shed, changes the equation entirely. An earthen ridge on the north side changes it further. Ground that has never been turned, that carries decades of undisturbed thermal mass beneath it, changes it most of all. He took her hand and held it against the wall beside his own. He let it stay there for a full minute, patient with the silence while she felt what the stone was holding. The warmth that met her palm was not the warmth of a fire or a stove. It was something older than that, something that had been accumulating since the snows of the previous winter melted, stored in degrees through April and May and June and July and August, and released now 6 feet underground in a slow and deliberate giving back. Then he stood and lifted the lamp and led her back up the steps. He did not add anything. He did not summarize or repeat himself. He trusted the stone wall to make the argument on its own terms. "When you understand that," he said at the top of the stairs, with the cold October air of the surface replacing the cool air of the cellar, "you stop fighting winter. You start borrowing what the ground already has." She was 9 years old. She did not fully understand what he meant, not in any practical sense. But she felt the warmth that was not quite warmth, the cool that was warmer than anything above them, and she held on to the deliberate steadiness of his hand beside hers and kept it. The way you keep something you do not yet know you will need. She thought of the lesson periodically in the years between. Not obsessively, not with any urgency. The way you think of a fact that has no immediate application, but sits somewhere accessible in the back of the mind, like the name of a plant your grandmother taught you, or the right way to set a trap you have not needed to set. It surfaced when she was digging garden beds and felt the way the soil changed temperature with depth, or when she stepped into a barn after a cold night and noticed that the animals had held more warmth than the air outside would have predicted. She filed each observation alongside the lesson and moved on. She would not need it for 24 years. Vera and Nathan Caldwell arrived in the Crow Wing Valley in the spring of 1866, 1 year after the war ended. Nathan had come home from 3 years with the Army of the Cumberland without visible wounds, but with a quality of stillness in the evenings that Vera had learned not to ask about directly. He was a practical man, organized in the way that men who have survived disorganized things tend to become organized. He kept a leather ledger in which he recorded every transaction, every agreement, every payment made or received in a handwriting that was small and dense and completely legible. He did not trust memory, he told her once. Memory adjusts, paper does not. He had learned this during his years in the Army, where a man's survival sometimes depended on someone else's record keeping, and where he had understood that records were frequently wrong in ways that mattered and infrequently right in ways that did not. He had decided that if records were going to exist, they should be right, and if they were going to be right, he was the one who needed to keep them. This was not a quality Vera had expected to love about him. It turned out to be one of the things she loved most. They purchased 80 acres along a tributary of the Crow Wing from a man who had given up after 2 difficult winters and was willing to take a reasonable offer and the dignity of walking away. The land was honest, Nathan said when he first walked it. He meant it as a practical judgment, not a romantic one. The timber was a usable, not ornamental. The hay ground would produce if worked. The creek was in the right place for a reliable water source. The topography offered wind shelter from the northwest, which was the direction that mattered most in a Minnesota winter. He spent the first day walking the perimeter and the second day walking the interior, and on the evening of the second day, he told Vera what he had found and what it would require and what he thought it was worth, and she listened and asked 3 questions, and at the end of the third question, they both understood that this was the place. The first year they built the house. The second year Nathan built the woodshed, an open-faced structure 18 feet wide and 12 feet deep, roofed with cedar shakes open on the south side for loading and pulling, with its back wall anchored against a low ridge of earth that broke the prevailing northwest wind. He built it in the northeast corner of the property because the ridge was there and the wind came from the northwest, and he understood without being told that putting your wood storage where the wind could not reach it from behind was simply common sense. The third year brought a drought that cut the hay yield by a third. They sold 2 pigs at the summer fair to cover the shortfall and bought supplemental hay from Kern to make up the difference. Nathan recorded the transaction in his ledger that evening without complaint and mentioned afterward that they would need to expand the hay ground in the low section the following spring. They did. The fourth year the yield was sufficient. The fifth year they had surplus enough to sell a portion at the county seat. The farm did not become easier exactly, but it became more known to them, and knowing it made the work more efficient even when the work itself did not change. Vera noticed the ground beneath the woodshed the day Nathan finished it. She stood in the shade of the new cedar roof and felt the quality of the packed earth underfoot, and thought without quite forming the thought into words that this was the right kind of ground. Undisturbed for decades, sheltered from rain and frost by the floor above it, sitting in the permanent shadow of the ridge that broke the wind. She had noticed without the language to fully describe it at the time that this ground had a different quality than the ground in the fields or the hillside behind the house. It was denser, carrying decades of temperature stability under the protection of the roof. If you understood what that meant, the location was obvious. She had not yet thought all of this through in explicit terms. She'd only thought this ground is different. This is where I would dig. She filed it away without saying anything. They also dug a root cellar into the hillside behind the house in their third year. 14 feet long, 8 feet wide, its walls lined with stacked fieldstone, its roof made of rough-cut lumber under 2 feet of banked earth. In a mild winter, it held between 38 and 42 degrees, cold enough barely to keep root vegetables and jarred stores from spoiling. Vera did not trust it from the first winter. The walls were not deep enough. The position was wrong, exposed to ground temperature swings on the south side where the sun hit the hillside directly through the afternoon hours. She told Nathan. He agreed. They put it on the list of things to improve. Nathan had a particular relationship with the list, which is to say he knew it existed and consulted it periodically and genuinely intended to work through it, but also understood that the urgent always deferred the important and that a farm with limited hands would always have more urgent things than important ones. This was not carelessness. It was arithmetic. Two people building a farm from raw ground in a climate that did not forgive delay have a fixed number of working hours, and the hours that keep the farm alive today will always take priority over the hours that would make it better tomorrow. Vera accepted this because she understood it. She simply kept her own list separate from his of the things she would address when she absolutely had to. The summer before Nathan died was the last summer she had thought about the Ohio cellar specifically. He had been talking about finally addressing the hillside cellar that autumn, about the improvements they would make. She had been about to say something about position and depth, about where she would actually dig, if she were digging, when the conversation had shifted to something else. She had not brought it back. There had been times, she thought. There would be more evenings. There would be more conversations. This is how time works against you in ways you cannot see until afterward. And then there was Silas Holt. He lived 2 miles to the west on 200 acres of mixed timber and cropland. He was a man who understood land in the particular way that men who want more of it tend to understand it, which is to say he understood it primarily in terms of what it would eventually be worth to him. He had asked Nathan twice in 8 years whether they would consider selling their 80 acres, framing both questions in the cordial language of neighborly interest. The first time he had made it sound like idle curiosity. The second time he had attached a number, which Nathan had declined with the same courtesy he brought to everything, and which Vera had noted was 15% below what the land was worth. The gap between his number and the land's actual value told her more about Holt's intentions than the asking had. She noticed the way he looked at their property when they crossed paths at the county seat, the way his eyes moved across the timber on the north slope and the hay ground in the low spots. It was the look of a man performing an ongoing appraisal, a man who knew what something was worth and was waiting for the moment when circumstances might make the owner less certain of its value. She noticed it. She said nothing. The summer of 1874 arrived dry and hot, and Nathan worked through it without complaint, the way he worked through everything methodically and without theater. In the last week of July, after a long run of days behind the plow, in the full heat of a Minnesota summer, he came in from the north field bent at the middle and said his stomach had been troubling him since morning. By the following evening, the pain had moved and deepened in a way that Vera recognized from things her mother had described years before. She did not panic. She felt the shape of what was happening with the same directness she brought to anything that could not be undone by feeling badly about it. She assessed what she had. She assessed what she needed. Then she acted. She saddled Flint in the dark and rode 18 miles to the nearest physician. The doctor was out on a call of his own, not expected back until morning. She waited on his porch through the night. The porch faced east, and the hours before dawn were very long. She sat in the doctor's wooden chair and watched the sky change from black to gray to a pale, uncertain color that was not quite morning. She thought about Nathan in the bed at the farm and about what he needed and about the 18 miles between here and there and about the fact that she could not be in both places at once. This was the first genuinely hopeless feeling she had experienced in her adult life, and it had a very specific texture. Not despair, the recognition that some outcomes are not determined by effort alone. She rode back with the doctor at first light. Nathan died on the fourth day. He was 36 years old. She sat with him through the last night without sleeping. Not because there was anything she could do, but because leaving felt wrong, and because the quality of his breathing in those final hours told her that the end was close and that she should be present for it. He had been present for everything that mattered to her. She would be present for this. He had been conscious enough on the second afternoon in the narrow window between the worst of the fever and the beginning of the end of it to hold her hand and say two words. Not a name, not any of the things that people say when they know the shape of what is coming. Just don't sell. She understood. There were 9 people at the burial on the small rise above the east field. The Lindquist family from the north, polite and sincere. The 2 Pemberton brothers who worked land to the south and came because they believed in showing up. Fletcher Kern, who had traded labor with Nathan on fence lines for years and drove 3 miles to stand with his hat in his hands at the edge of the grave without saying anything. 2 women from the settlement down the valley, the minister who had come from town for the day, and Silas Holt. He arrived just before the minister finished. He stood at the far edge of the group, hat in hand, head slightly bowed, correct in every visible way. He left before most of the others, walking toward his wagon without hurrying. Vera was accepting a covered dish from the Lindquist woman when she heard boots stop behind her. "Mrs. Caldwell," he said, "I know this is not the moment, but if you find yourself needing to settle the property, I want you to know I would make a fair offer. You shouldn't have to face a winter out here alone." She did not turn around immediately. She finished accepting the dish. She thanked the Lindquist woman. Then she turned and looked at Silas Holt for a long moment without speaking. Then she went inside and closed the door. She stood in the kitchen for a moment without moving. The offer had been framed as kindness, as concern, as neighborly generosity. That was the most precise part of how Silas Holt operated. He was never rude enough to give you something to object to directly. He was simply present with a number in his head at the moments when your resistance was supposed to be lowest. She would not forget that he had calculated the timing. You do not forget the calculations of people who are calculating against you. Fletcher Kern was still at the edge of the yard. He had heard. He stood looking at the closed door and then at the road where Holt's wagon was already moving, and then he put his hat back on and walked to his own wagon without a word to anyone. What Vera carried through the rest of that afternoon and into the weeks that followed was not grief alone, though grief was present in everything she did. It was something sharper. Silas Holt had prepared that offer before Nathan was cold. He had the words ready. He had calculated the moment. That calculation told her more about the months ahead than anything else could have. She had 80 acres. She had Flint and Bess. She had the woodshed and the house and the tools and the root cellar cut into the hillside that she had never fully trusted. 3 weeks into widowhood with winter building on the horizon, she went down to inspect it and found what she had been afraid she would find. The east wall was weeping. Not from rain, not from surface water, but from below moisture wicking upward through the stone joints by capillary pressure. leaving the wall dark and the air inside faintly damp. She dug at the corner of the floor with a spade and found the cause within 20 minutes. Holt's drainage ditch, the one he had regraded that past spring to redirect runoff from his upper field, had shifted the subsurface water table on her property by enough to put her cellar floor directly in the path of a slow underground seep. Whether he had done it deliberately was a question she considered for exactly one afternoon before deciding it did not matter. The effect was the same either way. In a real cold snap, everything inside would freeze. She could not afford that. She could not afford anything she had not already done. She stood in the door of the woodshed and looked at the ground beneath her feet, the cedar roof above, the earthen ridge behind the north wall, the packed, undisturbed subsoil that had never been turned in all the years the shed had stood there. She thought of her father's hand pressed flat against a fieldstone wall in Ohio. She went back to the house and got her notebook and sat at the kitchen table and began to work out the dimensions. Before she had finished the first page of calculations, Silas Holt sent a man to her door. The man was polite and younger than Holt by 20 years. He handed her a folded piece of paper and waited. The paper stated that Nathan Caldwell had borrowed $40 from Silas Holt in the spring of 1871, that the debt had never been repaid, and that Vera, as the surviving party responsible for Nathan's obligations, was expected to settle the balance within 30 days. If she could not, the matter would be referred to the county court. The man waited. Vera folded the paper. "Thank you," she said, and closed the door. $40. It was the precise amount that, taken from her remaining cash reserves, would make a difficult winter catastrophic. She did not believe for one moment that Nathan had borrowed $40 from Silas Holt and failed to record it. Nathan had never failed to record anything. But belief was not proof, and proof was what a county court would require. She went to the floor beside the bed. Nathan had kept a wooden box there. Inside was the leather ledger, its pages tight, and even the handwriting small and completely legible in the lamplight. She had always thought of the ledger as Nathan's way of remembering what she already knew. But sitting on the edge of the bed with the box on her lap, she understood that the ledger was not for her. It was for exactly this moment. When Nathan was not there to confirm what had happened, when his word alone was no longer available, when the only thing left of his knowledge was the shape it had made on paper. She opened it to 1871 and turned the pages slowly. March 14th. The entry was 4 lines in Nathan's standard format: date, transaction, amount, verification. Paid in full, $40, S. Holt. Witness B. Price. She sat on the edge of the bed and read it again. Then she closed the ledger and held it in her lap. Borden Price owned the general store in town. He had been in the valley longer than most people and had a hand directly or indirectly in most of the commercial activity in the settlement. He had also, on March 14th of 1871, signed his name as witness to a payment that Silas Holt was now claiming had never been made. Whether Price had known what Holt intended, or whether he had simply found it convenient to remember nothing, was another question Vera did not spend much time on. She saddled Flint the next morning and rode into town. The store had 3 customers when she arrived: a farm woman she knew by sight, an older man examining seed catalogs near the back wall, and a young man waiting at the counter. Price was behind the counter. He saw her come in and gave no visible indication of what he might be thinking. Vera set the ledger on the counter and opened it to the March 1871 page. She placed her finger below the line with his name. "Mr. Price," she said, "do you remember the 14th of March, 1871? Price looked at the page. He looked at it long enough that the silence itself became a kind of answer. "I signed that," he said. "Yes, you did." She said it clearly enough that everyone in the room could hear without straining. Please tell Mr. Holt that I have full documentation of this transaction. If he chooses to take the matter to county court, I will bring this ledger and the name of every person in this room who heard you confirm your signature today." She looked at the room for a moment. The farm woman near the front had gone very still, with the concentrated attention of someone absorbing everything. The older man had put down the seed catalog entirely. A transaction had taken place in this room, not the one she had come in to conduct, and all four of them knew it. She picked up the ledger. She bought the salt she had come for. She put the exact change on the counter and walked out. Silas Holt did not take the matter to county court. What he understood and what Vera understood was that this was not over. This was a particular kind of man finding out the particular kind of woman he was dealing with. There would be more attempts. The next one would be more careful. She returned to the farm and went directly to the woodshed. She stood in the back half of it in the shadows under the cedar shakes and looked at the ground beneath her feet. Then she went to the tool shed, came back with a long-handled spade, measured out a rectangle 9 feet by 14 feet in the hard-packed earth under the stacked birch, and drove the blade in. The first foot came up easily, black topsoil, loose and light, carrying the smell of roots and long-dried rain. The second foot was heavier, dense, clay-laced subsoil that broke in dark clods and smelled of iron, the smell of ground that had not seen light in a very long time. By the third foot, she had switched to a mattock, working in short, measured swings, loading the broken earth into the wheelbarrow and pushing it 30 yards to a low spot at the edge of the hayfield where the displaced soil would be invisible from the road. She worked 3 hours in the morning and 2 in the afternoon every day through 11 days of pale September light until she had a pit 9 feet deep. She had expected the work to be harder in one respect and easier in another. Harder, the weight of the stone was a different kind of physical demand than field work, a specific strain in the back and arms she had not trained for, and the first 3 days of loading the loaded cart were very difficult. Easier, the earth itself cooperated once she understood it. The clay in the third foot resisted the mattock, but broke cleanly once the tool found the correct angle, and after the first day, at that depth, she had the angle and the work went faster. There is a particular satisfaction in working with a material that resists honestly, that tells you exactly what it requires and yields when you give it that. Stone and earth were honest in this way. They did not surprise her. The walls she lined with flat fieldstone collected from the creek bank since early July. 160 pounds of it hauled in the wagon over 3 trips and stacked near the shed through the summer months, when she had not yet told herself exactly what they were for. She fitted the stones, dry without mortar, tight against the earth walls, tamping coarse sand into the gaps. Stone against earth. Earth surrounding stone. For the floor, she packed the earth flat, leveled it by eye and touch, covered it first with 3 inches of coarse wash sand. Then she built a fire at the edge of the field and heated smaller flat stones in the flames, wrapping each one in burlap, while it was still hot enough to scorch the cloth, and carrying it quickly down the 8 steps she had cut into the earth wall, placing it on the sand while it still held heat. She burned the heel of her left hand once, reaching for a stone that was hotter than she had judged, but she did not stop. A floor laid with stones that already carried warmth when they went down would not surrender that warmth in a single night or even a series of nights. It would release it in degrees across weeks. The roof she made from 6-inch rough-sawn pine planks laid across the 9-foot span in 2 sections, supported at the center by a beam she mortised into notches cut into the stone walls. Over the planks, she packed 4 inches of the driest hay from the previous summer's cutting, compressed by hand and layered with care. Over the hay, she stretched a sheet of waxed canvas salvaged from a grain cover, overlapping the edges, a full foot on each side, and tucking them down against the stone. Over the canvas, she shoveled 12 inches of subsoil, pressing it into a low arch with her hands and feet until the surface looked like undisturbed ground. Then she stacked the birch back. Every split piece returned to exactly where it had been. The rows neat and ordinary. The hatch a 2-foot square of pine planks with a leather pull strap sitting concealed beneath a third row from the right. To anyone loading or pulling firewood from that shed, nothing had changed. The floor looked solid. The wood sat in its ordinary rows. The building was the same building it had always been, doing the same thing it had always done. That too was part of the design, not an afterthought, the first thought. On the last evening of September, before she began lowering her winter stores, she went down alone with the lamp and stood in the finished pit and held her bare hand at chest height and waited. 42 degrees. She held her hand in the air a moment longer. The serious cold had not even arrived yet, and already the stone walls were giving back what they had stored through summer. The calculation was confirmed. She let that fact settle the way a calculated thing settles when it has been built carefully enough to earn that confirmation. She thought of her father, his hand flat against a fieldstone wall in Ohio, his patience with the silence before the explanation. The way he had said it, not like a lesson, but like a fact, he was simply transferring from his hands to hers. She thought of Nathan, 2 words at the edge of a fever: don't sell. She turned off the lamp. She climbed the 8 steps. She fitted the hatch back into place and arranged the birch rows above it and walked to the house. The work was not finished. She still had to load the stores. She still had to carry everything she needed through whatever the winter brought. There was no certainty in any of it, only preparation, only the conviction that a thing built carefully enough would do what it was built to do when the moment came to ask it. But for the first time since July, she went to bed without the particular weight of the unfinished sitting on her chest. There was still Silas Holt. There would be more from him, she knew that. There was still the winter ahead, longer and colder than she could fully predict. There was still everything that could go wrong between now and spring. But below the woodshed, 9 feet under the packed earth where no one would think to look, the ground was holding 42 degrees, and it would hold. In the last days of September 1874, Vera loaded the pit. She worked by lamplight after the day's other tasks were done, lowering each item carefully down the 8 steps she had cut into the earth wall, and arranging everything with the deliberateness of someone who understood that the order things went in would determine the ease with which she could reach them in the dark of a February morning. 140 pounds of potatoes in burlap sacks, stacked against the north wall where the temperature would be most stable, 60 pounds of turnips alongside them, 4 crocks of salted pork sealed with rendered fat, their lids wired down and the wire ends tucked under. 11-quart jars of pickled beets and cabbage she had put up through August, each one wiped clean and placed upright on the sand floor. 2 crocks of lard, a 50-pound sack of cornmeal inside the cedar box she had fitted with a tongue and groove lid to keep moisture from working in through the seams, and at the back, against the east wall where no casual reaching hand would find it first, a tin box containing $40 in paper money wrapped twice in oilcloth. She stood at the bottom of the full pit and raised the lamp and turned slowly. The crocks sat solid on the sand floor. The jars caught the light and gave it back amber and dark red. The sacks were dry. The cedar box was sealed. Everything she would need to live through a hard winter without leaving the property or spending a dollar she did not have. She climbed out, set the hatch back into place, stacked the birch over it, and went to bed. The first night in 3 months, she had gone to sleep without the weight of the unfinished pressing on her chest. 3 days after she finished loading, Edna Sutter came by. Edna lived a mile and a half to the west on a small property she had managed alone since her husband died in 1872. She was not a malicious woman. She was a woman through whom information traveled from one place to another without much friction, and she understood that useful information had its own kind of value in a community where people depended on each other through hard seasons. She had visited Vera 4 times since Nathan's funeral, each time with a small offering of eggs or preserved squash, and each time she left having surveyed whatever was visible from the yard. The first visit in August, she had asked about Vera's intentions for the winter and how she was managing alone. The second, in early September, she had asked whether Vera had considered the social benefits of accepting certain offers of help from people who were in a position to give it. The language was Edna's own, but the thinking behind it was not. Vera had heard those specific phrasings before from a man standing at the edge of a funeral with a prepared offer in his head. The third visit in late September had been brief, almost perfunctory, and Vera had noticed that Edna's eyes spent more time on the stack of creek stone near the shed than on Vera herself. The fourth visit, now in October, was the most direct of all. Edna stopped her wagon at the gate and looked for a long moment at the flattened area at the edge of the hayfield where the displaced earth from the digging had been dumped over several weeks and was only now beginning to blend with the surrounding ground. Then she looked at the woodshed. "Vera," she said, "people are talking about what you've been doing out here. I want you to know I've been speaking well of you." "I appreciate that," Vera said. "What exactly is it that you built?" "Improved storage." Edna turned her hat in her hands. "Under the woodshed. In that general area. Is it something Silas Holt should know about?" He mentioned he had heard something, and he seemed to think it might affect the property value if you were ever to reconsider selling. Vera looked at Edna steadily. "Tell Mr. Holt that my storage arrangements are my own concern and that the property is not for sale." Edna drove away with the egg she had brought, which Vera had declined to accept. From the porch, Vera watched the wagon reach the road and turn west. Whatever she had said would reach Silas Holt before the day was out. It would not stop him. It would only tell him that she had built something he had not yet found a way to approach. The first real test came on December 8th. The north porch thermometer read -14 degrees Fahrenheit when she woke. She went through the regular tags, fed Flint and Bess, split the day's wood, made her breakfast. At midday, she walked to the woodshed, moved aside the third row of birch, and lifted the hatch. The air from below was not cold. It was cool and faintly moist, the particular atmosphere of ground that has been separated from what the surface is doing. She went down all 8 steps and stood on the stone floor and raised her bare right hand to chest height and held it there. 40 degrees Fahrenheit, possibly 41. In the 9 feet of stone and sand and packed earth, her father had taught her to read, winter was conducting its business somewhere far above. She stood there longer than the temperature reading required. She needed to be certain she was not mistaken, not about the number, but about what it meant. It meant the floor stones laid in September were still releasing what she had given them. The principle her father had described was working exactly as he had said it would. She climbed back up. She stacked the birch. She walked to the house to make supper. She did not tell anyone. There was no one to tell, and she had not yet decided whether the test had confirmed the plan or only the first version of it. She would need more winters to know. She came through the winter of 1874 without significant loss. What she took from the first winter was not just the temperature readings, but the specific pattern of them. The pit was not a static thing. It was a system, and like all systems, it responded to conditions she had partially controlled and conditions she had not. The hay insulation had held well in the sustained cold, but she had noticed in late February that the moss on the underside of the canvas carried a faint dampness she had not expected. She made a note. She would watch for it the following year and understand it better before she decided what it meant. The winter of 1875 was milder than any she had experienced in Minnesota. In the spring of 1876, she made two small modifications to the pit's roof layer and replaced two stones in the west wall that had shifted during a hard freeze. Small adjustments, the kind that come from watching a thing operate through a real season and understanding the difference between what you planned and what the plan actually required. The winter of 1876 brought the first real confirmation. It came in the form of 19 days of cold she had not seen before, even after 10 years in Minnesota. The temperature dropped below -22 on the third day and did not come back above it until the 19th. The birch in the north woodlot cracked in the nights. The suet she put out for the birds froze solid within an hour of being placed. The creek made sounds she had not heard it make before, the ice groaning and shifting as the cold drove deeper into it from above. She slept in her clothes for the last 5 days of the cold snap, not because she was too tired to undress, but because sleeping in clothes meant she could be out of bed and functional in under a minute if something went wrong. She woke at intervals through the night to check the bedroom fire and to listen. A farm in extreme cold has its own specific vocabulary of sounds, and you learn to hear the difference between the wood of a house settling normally and the sound of a structure that is beginning to lose the argument with the temperature outside it. Her house did not make that second sound. The chinking she had done in October on the north wall had held. The pit held at 39 degrees throughout the entire 19-day run. She pulled from it twice a week, taking what she needed and sealing the hatch each time with the same care she had used in September. She lost nothing. The Lindquist family, who had a cellar older and shallower than the one Vera had replaced, lost a third of their stored potatoes in that same cold snap. The Pemberton brothers lost their entire supply of preserved apples. The families who had watched Vera work the ground beneath her woodshed with polite skepticism 2 years before were now doing arithmetic in their heads that was coming out differently than before. The word that moved through the community was not admiration, it was curiosity wound tight with the particular suspicion that people direct at anyone who was prepared for something they failed to prepare for. It was easier in some respects to wonder whether Vera had done something improper than to consider whether they had done something insufficient. The direct confrontation came in March of 1877. Vera was at Price's general store buying salt and lamp oil when Edna Sutter spoke up from across the room loudly enough that the 4 other people present could hear without effort. "I think we all know," Edna said, addressing the room in the manner of someone speaking to one specific person while performing for several, that some people in this valley have been storing a good deal more than they declare to the county. It would not be right to let that pass without mention. The store went careful. Price did not look up from the counter. Fletcher Kern was in the back corner near the seed catalogs, and he had been there for several minutes before Edna began talking. He was looking at the floor with the concentrated attention of a man who is listening to everything. The farm woman near the front had gone very still. The older man by the catalogs had turned slightly toward the exchange without moving his feet, the practiced posture of someone listening carefully while appearing not to. Vera set down the salt. "If you have a specific complaint," she said, "you could write it down and submit it to the county assessor. That is the appropriate channel." Edna had not expected to be answered directly. "I am only saying what people are wondering," she said. "I know what you are doing," Vera said, "and I know who is wondering." She paid for her salt and lamp oil and left. Kern was still in the store when she walked out. He did not follow her or say anything. But as Vera's wagon moved down the road, she understood that he had formed a judgment about what he had witnessed and that the judgment was not against her. She found out what he intended to do with it in the summer of 1878. He stopped his wagon at her gate and came through without being asked, the way people do when they have been deciding something for a long time and have finally decided. He was not a man who approached things sideways. "Mrs. Caldwell, the thing under your woodshed, does it actually do what you seem to think it does, or have you been fortunate?" It was the most honest question anyone had asked her about it in 4 years. In January of 1876, she said, "The temperature held below -22 for 19 days. My stores came through intact. The Lindquists lost a third of their potatoes in the same cold snap, with a cellar older and shallower than the one I replaced. I do not consider 19 days below -22 a fortunate winter." Kern was quiet for a moment. He had the look of a man running numbers. "How deep did you go?" he said. 9 feet. I have bedrock at 6 on the south portion of my land. 6 will work. Not as well at the extremes, but for an ordinary Minnesota January, if the position and the roof are right, 6 feet is sufficient." He nodded slowly. "And if the site has no ridge to block the north wind, then you compensate with roof thickness and position the access from the south side. Every site has a different answer. The principle stays the same, but the application changes. That is why I cannot tell you exactly what to build. I can only tell you what I know about what the ground is doing, and you have to figure out the rest for your ground." He looked at her for a moment. "You figured it out from something your father showed you." "He showed me the idea," she said. "He never mentioned floor stones or ventilation. I found those on my own." "The hard way or the easy way?" "Both," she said. "You find out the easy things the hard way and the hard things the easy way if you are paying attention." He looked at the woodshed for a long moment before climbing back onto his wagon. He had the look of a man who had arrived expecting a shorter conversation and was leaving with a longer one than he had planned, for which was usually the sign of a conversation that had been worth having. He said he might come back to ask more. She told him she knew where he was. In the years that followed Kern's visit, Vera made 2 more improvements to the pit. The first came from a wet summer that left the original hay insulation layer compressed against the canvas roof, its effective thickness reduced by more than half. She replaced it with packed dry moss from the North Woods, which was denser, shed moisture better, and did not settle with age. The second improvement was a ventilation pipe, a salvage section of stovepipe fitted with a damper installed through the roof layer to allow a controlled exchange of air. This resolved the condensation she had been managing manually since the first winter and made the temperature inside more stable across the full range of conditions. The 2 modifications had taken a total of 4 days of work spread across 2 autumns. The difference in performance was not dramatic, but it was measurable in exactly the conditions that mattered most: the extended cold snaps, the wet summers, that tried to undo what the dry autumns had built. Each modification addressed something she had actually observed. Neither had been planned in advance. Both had been necessary. There was a satisfaction in the refinements that was different from the satisfaction of the original construction. The original had been built under pressure, in the shadow of loss, in the specific fear of a woman alone facing her first Minnesota winter without a partner. The refinements were made from something closer to professional interest. She was no longer managing survival. She was improving a system that already worked, in doing so from a position of understanding rather than urgency. The 2 kinds of work feel different in the hands. By the start of 1880, what sat below the woodshed was not the original construction anymore. It was the original principle, refined over 5 years of observation and correction by someone who paid close attention to what was working and what was not, and who made changes based on what she had actually seen rather than on what she had assumed would be true. The distance between those two things is the distance between a design and a working tool. The winter of 1880 arrived with the seriousness the valley had not seen before. On January 14th, the North Porch thermometer read minus 29 degrees Fahrenheit. By evening, it was minus 33. The temperature did not ease in the afternoons the way Minnesota cold normally does. It dropped and held and dropped further. The sky was the specific white gray of sustained high-pressure flat, and without movement, the kind of sky that tells you nothing is changing and that nothing is going to change for some time. The animals knew before the thermometer confirmed anything. Flint had been restless 2 days before the cold locked in, pacing the fence line in the afternoon, stopping frequently to test the air with his nostrils. Bess had gone off her milk production by a third on the 12th, a full day before the temperature reached its lowest sustained reading. Vera had observed both things and drawn the same conclusion the animals had already drawn. She had begun rationing firewood the day before any instrument would have told her to. By January 17th, the reading was minus 38. At that depth of cold, the exhaled breath does not drift. It crystallizes immediately and falls a shimmer of ice dropping in front of your face as you breathe. The birch trees in the north woodlot cracked in the nights, a sound that carried across the snow like something breaking that was not built to break. The creek, frozen solid since November, groaned under the new cold pressing deeper into its ice from above. The hinges on the barn door froze open on the morning of the 18th. Vera freed them with 20 minutes of careful work, with a candle flame holding the flame close, but not touching the iron, waiting for the metal to give. She ran the house on 3 fires with the precision of someone who had developed over 6 winters alone a specific method for calculating fuel consumption. In the late afternoon of each cold day before the evening temperature drop, she counted the stacked rows in the woodshed, estimating the volume by height and depth and the density of the split, then applied a consumption rate based on the outside temperature and wind direction. It was an imprecise calculation. Cold varied day to day, and fire behavior varied with wood moisture and chimney draft, and a dozen other factors she could not fully control. But an imprecise calculation made daily is more useful than a precise one made once. She knew where she stood within a margin she could work with, and that margin was enough to make sound decisions. The kitchen range only during cooking and the hour following. The parlor stove on 2 loads per day instead of 3. The box stove in the bedroom barely fed, just enough to prevent the water bucket from going solid. She checked the animals twice daily. She ate simply. She did not waste anything. Every morning she checked the pit. On the 3rd day of the sustained cold, she went down before dawn with the lamp and no gloves on her right hand. She descended the 8 steps and raised her bare palm at chest height in the dark and waited. 41 degrees Fahrenheit, outside minus 38. The stone walls were dry. The sand floor was cool but not cold. The jars stood intact. The lard was firm. The potatoes in their burlap sacks were sound. The ventilation pipe was doing exactly what it was supposed to do. In over 5 years of operation, through 3 documented cold snaps and 1 hard test, the pit had not failed her once. She allowed herself one moment of something that was not quite pride and not quite relief. It sat between those 2 things, closer to recognition. The sensation of a calculated thing performing exactly as the calculation predicted, under conditions the calculation had been built to address. Then she climbed out and went to make breakfast. On the 7th day, Deputy Amos Colby arrived. She saw him from the north window, a rider moving along the county road with the deliberate steadiness of a man who has been in the cold for a long time and will not let the remaining distance stop him. His coat was dark at the collar and cuffs where frost had settled and stayed. He turned at her gate without slowing and came up the lane. "Mrs. Caldwell, I'm Deputy Colby from the county seat. I've received a report describing an unlicensed underground structure on this property used to conceal stored goods from the property assessment. I need to inspect the premises." Vera stood on the porch and looked at him. His hands on the reins were rigid. His horse was blowing hard. "Come inside," she said. "Your horse can go in the barn. You need to warm your hands before anything else." The request gave her two practical things she needed. It gave her time to think because the thinking done standing in -30-degree air while a stranger waits is not the same quality of thinking as the thinking done in a warm kitchen with a cup of tea between your hands. And it gave her the opportunity to retrieve something from the drawer. Before Colby settled himself at the table, he climbed down without argument. He was a practical man. She could see that the kind of man who understood that functioning in a crisis required functioning first, which meant warmth before anything else. She led his horse to the barn herself and settled it next to Flint and Bess. He watched her do this without comment. She filed that away. When she came back, Colby was standing at the kitchen door with his hat in his hands and frost beginning to run from his collar. She put the kettle on. She went to the drawer beside the stove and removed the notebook she had kept since September of 1874, the record of 11 days of construction entries and 5 years of modification logs and temperature readings entered in two-column tables. She set it on the table in front of the chair where Colby was going to sit. Then she poured the tea. Colby sat down and looked at the notebook on the table, and Vera stood at the stove and waited. On the 9th day, Bess nearly died. Vera had been checking the cow 3 times daily through the worst of the cold extra hay each morning. Warm water carried from the kitchen range in the evenings, careful attention to the quality of breathing and the stability of stance. For an ordinary January cold snap, a mature dairy animal in good condition could manage. For the short ones, the ones that lasted 4 or 5 days before breaking the barn, held well enough. This was not a short one. She opened the barn door on the morning of January 22nd and knew before she read the thermometer that something had shifted. The air inside had the wrong quality. Not the ordinary cold of a barn in January, a deeper stillness, the kind that accumulates in a space that has been losing heat for too long without replenishing it. The center post thermometer read 9 degrees above zero. Bess stood at the far wall with her head lowered, breathing in shallow pulls. Her weight shifted forward onto her front legs. The water in the trough had frozen through the floating block Vera kept in it to slow the process. When Vera pressed her palm against Bess's flank, the warmth she found there was thinner than it should have been. The animal was doing the hard arithmetic of cold survival, pulling heat toward the core and leaving the periphery to manage as it could. 9 degrees above zero, the forecast showed no break before the 24th at the earliest. Vera stood in the barn doorway and looked at the woodshed 30 feet away. She looked at the 4-foot gap between the east wall of the barn and the west wall of the shed, the connecting passage she and Nathan had discussed and never built. She looked at the gap and at the thermometer and at Bess, and she did the calculation that emergencies demand, not the ideal solution, the sufficient one. 2 full hay bales from the loft opened into loose mass. A remnant section of waxed canvas, 12 feet long, left from the original pit construction. 4 lengths of rough sawn 2x6 from the shed rafters. A spool of baling wire, a hammer, and a box of 8 penny nails. She built a partition across the 4-foot gap. Not a wall, a wind barrier, and an insulating layer. The hay bales compressed into the width of the opening, the canvas stretched over them, and nailed into the wooden walls on both sides, the boards braced diagonally against the wind that came around the north end of the ridge in flat, sustained gusts. The work was not elegant. An experienced carpenter would have winced at the angles. She was not trying to build something that would last the decade. She was trying to build something that would work tonight and tomorrow and the day after until the temperature broke. That was a different standard from the one she applied to the pit, and a different kind of work, and she understood the difference and met it accordingly. It took her an hour and 20 minutes. Her fingers went numb twice. Both times she pressed them against Bess's neck and held them there until feeling came back, standing with her cheek against the animal's warm side, feeling the slow and deliberate rhythm of breathing that was working very hard but had not surrendered. She was not warming the barn. She had nothing to warm it with that would not be a fire risk in a board and batten structure. She was reducing the rate at which cold entered, sealing the gap through which the northwest wind had been pulling warmth out faster than the animal inside could replace it. Every gap sealed is a loss prevented. Every layer added between a living thing and that wind is degrees recovered without fuel cost. By mid-afternoon, she estimated the barn had risen to 13 above zero. Bess was standing squarely on all four legs. Vera walked to the kitchen, filled 2 buckets from the range reservoir, and carried them back with her arms wrapped around them across the 30 feet of open yard. Bess drank both in long, deliberate pulls. By evening, the barn was holding at 14 above zero. Bess moved to the hay rack on her own. That was the last signal Vera needed. She went inside and slept. On the evening of the 7th day, Deputy Amos Colby turned the pages of Vera's notebook slowly. Not the way a man turns pages when he is searching for something specific. The way a man turns pages when he is beginning to understand that what he expected to find is not what is in front of him. The notebook was meticulous in the same way that Nathan Caldwell's ledger had been meticulous, organized by date and by task, every entry specific enough to reconstruct exactly what had been done and why. September 4th, 9 feet depth, reached east wall, begun with creek, stone. September 7th floor, sand layer, completed 3 inches tamped level. September 9th floor, stones, fire heated, carried to pit in burlap, placed while warm. It continued for 11 days of entries, then shifted to the loading record, every item logged by weight and by date. It read the way an engineer's field notes read. It read the way the work of someone who knew exactly what they were doing read. Colby set the notebook down on the table. The tea in his cup had gone cold. "I need to see it," he said. "I know," Vera said. "Follow me." They went out the back door and across the yard in the dark. The temperature had not changed from what it had been when he arrived. Minus 31 degrees Fahrenheit. His horse was already in the barn with Bess and Flint, which Vera had arranged without being asked. She carried the lamp. He walked behind her, his boots loud in the compacted snow. At the woodshed, she moved the birch without hurrying. Split piece by split piece, the third row from the right setting, each piece aside in order until the hatch was clear. She pulled the leather strap and lifted the cover back. The air that came up from below was immediate and unmistakable. Not warm in any absolute sense, but warm relative to the world they were standing in, the way the air above a deep well is different from the air surrounding it. Colby took a step back, then forward again. He held his bare hand over the opening. Vera held the lamp so he could see down. The stone walls, the sand floor, the pine beam mortised across the center span. The small thermometer nailed to the east wall supported its column sitting just above the 40-degree mark. Colby looked at that thermometer for a long time. Then he looked at the thermometer nailed to the outer shed wall, minus 31. He crouched at the edge of the opening and looked into the pit. What he was looking at was 9 feet of stone-lined earth, holding 40 degrees of warmth in minus 31-degree air. He was looking at the inside of a calculated thing that was doing exactly what it had been calculated to do. He was a man who had inspected many things in his career as a county deputy, most of them either exactly as reported or worse, and what was in front of him now was neither. He stayed like that for a while. The lamp threw his shadow long behind him across the birch rows. Then he stood. He took his hat off, which he had not done inside the house, and turned it in his hands. The gesture of a man buying himself time to figure out what he actually wanted to say. The report I received, he said, described an unlicensed underground structure being used to conceal stored goods from property assessment. I know what the report described. The notebook you showed me does not look like concealment. No, it does not. Another silence. The cold pressed in around the edges of the lamp's small circle of light. I don't see a violation here, Mrs. Caldwell. I'll write the report that way. He put his hat back on, pulled his coat collar up, and walked back toward the barn to collect his horse. Vera stood at the open hatch a moment longer. She looked down into the 40-degree dark and then at the -31 dark around her, and thought about the specific kind of exhaustion that comes not from the work of building a thing, but from the work of defending it from people who never had any intention of understanding it. She fit the hatch back into place. She stacked the birch. Colby rode out before dawn 12 miles back to the county seat. He had said almost nothing during the walk from the woodshed to the barn. He had retrieved his horse, settled his hat, buttoned his coat to the top button, and mounted without the kind of preliminary remarks that men usually make when concluding an awkward visit. The absence of those remarks told her more than the remarks would have. A man who has found what he came looking for says something about it. A man who has found that the errand was not what he was told it was tends to leave quietly. The remaining days of the sustained cold she managed with the same arithmetic she had applied from the beginning. Firewood measured by the load, water by the bucket, the animals checked on schedule. The pit visited each morning, its reading unchanged. The cold had not broken, but it had stopped growing, and sometimes in an emergency that is all you can ask for. She never saw Colby again. 3 weeks later, when she went to the county office to pay her property assessment, the clerk told her without being asked that a complaint regarding her land had been reviewed and found without merit. Silas Holt had spent 4 years trying to move her off her property. He had tried an offer she could have been tempted by if grief had made her desperate. He had tried a debt she did not owe. He had used Edna Sutter as his eyes through 2 winters. He had used a deputy and a county office as his instrument in the coldest week of the hardest winter the valley had seen in living memory. Every time she had been ready. Every time the work she had done quietly and carefully, while no one was watching, had been the answer to whatever he had attempted. She did not feel triumphant. She felt tired in a very particular way. The tiredness of someone who has won a fight that should never have needed to be fought against an opponent whose only real weapon was the assumption that a woman alone would eventually run out of the will to stand her ground. She had not run out. What she had was something harder to name than stubbornness, though it contained that. It was more like the quality that keeps a person working when the outcome is not yet certain. The understanding that you cannot know in advance which actions will prove to have been necessary, and so you take all the actions that might be and trust the result to sort itself out. She had dug and built and argued and documented and done the work. The ground had held. The ground had always held. The cold broke on January 23rd, not suddenly. It never broke suddenly in that valley in January. A pressure shift moved through overnight. Something changed in the invisible architecture of the air above the plains, and the morning thermometer read -15 instead of -34. By the 28th, the reading was in the single digits above zero. By early February, what the old-timers in the valley called the second winter had settled in, which was simply winter continuing without the particular fury of the first. Vera checked her stores. The woodpile was down but not gone. She had burned through more than she had planned for in the worst days, rationing carefully, but there was enough to carry her through to March. The pit was almost entirely intact. The lard was firm, the jars uncracked, the potatoes sound the cornmeal dry in its cedar box. She brought up what she needed and resealed the hatch and stacked the birch back. She also checked Bess every morning that first week after the break, measuring recovery by the depth of breathing and the firmness of stance and the appetite with which the cow took the extra hay Vera brought in the early dark. By the third day after the temperature shifted, Bess was eating normally. By the fifth day, Vera stopped measuring and started trusting. Fletcher Kern came as soon as the roads allowed travel. He drove his wagon to the end of her lane and climbed down without being asked, and came through the gate and stood in the yard looking at the woodshed for a long time before he spoke. He had the precision of a man who had visited several properties before coming here, who had been assembling the full picture of the winter's damage across the valley for days, and who understood that when you deliver this kind of news, you do it completely rather than incompletely, because an incomplete account is its own kind of cruelty. The Lindquist cellar had frozen solid on the 12th day of the cold snap. They lost more than two-thirds of their root vegetables. A farmer named Calloway 8 miles east had lost livestock, and how many was more than Calloway was willing to say in public. Several families had come through with their lives and their food stores intact, but with nearly empty woodpiles, and were now scrambling to cut and haul and split before March took the last of the workable days. Then Kern told her about Silas Holt. Holt's root cellar, the old one cut into the slope behind his main barn, had gone below freezing on the 8th day. He had lost 40% of his stored potatoes and all of his salted pork. During the second week of cold, he had also lost 2 cattle in his north pasture barn when the structure's insulation failed at a temperature it had never been tested against. He had not made any public statements about his losses. Kern stood in the yard looking at the woodshed. The shed looked exactly as it always had. Cedar shakes holding a ridge of packed snow. Birch rows visible through the open face. The ordinary geometry of a building that had been standing in the same corner of the same property for 8 years, without apparently doing anything other than holding firewood. "Your stores came through?" Kern asked. "Yes. Bess, she's fine." He took his hat off and turned it in his hands. Vera recognized the gesture now. "That hole under the woodshed," he said. "Your father showed you how to do that." Vera thought about Owen Caldwell in Ohio in October of 1850, the lamplight, the warmth rising to meet her face at the bottom of the stone steps, his hand flat against the fieldstone wall, with the fingers spread. "He showed me the idea," she said. "I had to work out the rest myself." Kern nodded once the way men nod when they have been confirmed in a judgment they made a long time ago and have been patient about. He put his hat back on. He said he would like to come back with his oldest son if she was agreeable, because there were questions that would take more than a single afternoon to work through. She told him she was agreeable. He drove back toward the road. She stood in the yard after his wagon had gone and understood for the first time since July of 1874 that the thing she had built under the woodshed was not only her survival. It was also an answer to a question that other people had not yet known how to ask. Borden Price gave her the occasion to understand the other half of that. 3 weeks after Kern's visit, Vera went into town for salt and sewing supplies. She pushed open the door of the general store and heard Price's voice before she saw him. He was standing at the far end of the counter with 4 men, his posture comfortable and expansive. The posture of a man enjoying the position of being the person in the room who knows something others want to know. "Yes, I advised her from the start that she needed to think differently about her storage situation," he was saying. "I could see what was wrong with that old hillside cellar. Wrong orientation, not deep enough. I offered her some guidance back in the fall of '74, and she was sensible enough to act on it. That is what made the difference this winter. Two of the four men were looking at him with interest. One was looking at the door. He saw Vera come in. The room did not go exactly quiet. It went careful the way a room goes when everyone in it is aware of something that has not yet been named out loud. Vera set her basket on the counter. She did not raise her voice. "Mr. Price," she said. He turned, and there was a moment, just a fraction of a second, where something crossed his face that was not quite guilt and not quite calculation, but contained the essential ingredients of both. "You did not advise me in the fall of '74, she said. "You did not advise me at any point. What you did in the fall of '74 was sign your name as witness to a debt payment and then keep silent about that signature when someone else tried to use the same debt as a legal threat against me. I found your signature myself in my husband's ledger because Nathan had the habit of writing things down and I had the sense to look. Every decision about what sits under my woodshed was made by me based on something my father explained when I was 9 years old. I spent 11 days digging it by hand. I spent 6 years after that observing it, correcting what was wrong, improving what worked. I did that alone, not from guidance." The store was very quiet. One of the men at the counter had the look of someone who has heard a true thing said plainly and is deciding what to do with it. Price was looking at the surface of the counter. He had the posture of a man waiting for a door to close. "I am not saying this to embarrass you," she said. "I am saying it because what happened in this valley this winter may happen again. If anyone in this room wants to understand how to build something that holds through another January, like the one we just had, they should know where the knowledge actually comes from and who has it." The four people who had been in the store when she arrived would tell others what they had heard. Information moved through a community the way water moved through, following the lines of least resistance, pooling where people gathered. By the end of the week, what she had said would be known in most of the farms within 6 miles. Some of them would draw the conclusion she intended that the knowledge came from a specific source, and that source was available to share it. Others would draw the conclusion that Borden Price was not to be trusted on this particular subject, which was also a useful piece of information for a community to have. She bought the salt. She bought the sewing thread. She put the exact money on the counter, picked up her basket, and left. Fletcher Kern was on the steps outside. He had been coming in for a mail order when he heard her voice through the door. He had stopped where he was and listened to the whole thing from beginning to end. When she came out, he looked at her for a moment without speaking. "You should have let me buy you coffee first," he said. It was the first thing that had made her smile in a very long time. She walked to her wagon. She did not look back at the store. The road home was 6 miles of frozen ruts and bare fence lines in fields that had been white for 3 months. She drove the whole way without speaking to Flint, which was unusual for her. She was trying to hold on to the feeling, the specific sensation of having said a true thing in the right room at the right moment. It did not happen often enough to take for granted, and she wanted to remember exactly how it felt in case it did not happen again for a long time. 3 weeks after that, Kern returned to the farm with his oldest son, Daniel, a young man of 22, with his father's habit of measuring things before he moved them and his mother's patience with silence. They brought a written list of questions. The list was organized by category: construction, first, then material specifications, then seasonal operation, then problem solving for specific failure conditions. It was a list of a young man who had thought carefully about what he did not know. Vera read it top to bottom before answering anything, because the list told her more about what Daniel understood than what he was asking did. She had come to understand one thing about passing knowledge along in the preceding year: begin with what the person already understands. Daniel already understood soil and stone and weather. He understood the way temperature moved through a barn and the way the ground froze and thawed at different depths depending on what was above it. She did not need to teach him the foundational physics. She needed to show him how the specific application worked in practice, which is a different kind of teaching from the kind that starts at the beginning. She answered every question. She gave them the complete account, including the mistakes she had made in the first version and the two modifications she had made in the years since. She told them about the hay layer that had compressed in the humid summer and lost nearly half its insulating value before she caught it, and how she had replaced it with packed dry moss from the North Woods, which was denser, did not settle with age, and performed better in every condition she had tested it against. She told them about the ventilation pipe she had added the year after, a salvaged section of stovepipe fitted with a damper that allowed controlled air exchange without meaningful heat loss. She wrote the loading schedule down for them on a separate sheet of paper with the specific temperature indicators to watch for across the seasons. Then she took them down. Daniel Kern stood on the stone floor and looked up at the moss and canvas ceiling and turned slowly, taking it in. Then he reached out and placed his right hand flat against the east wall, palm open, fingers spread. Vera stood at the base of the steps and did not move. She had seen that gesture exactly once before. From her father in Ohio in October of 1850, in the lamplight of a storage cellar beneath a shed floor, when she was 9 years old, and the hand against the stone was reading something she had not yet learned to read. She understood it now. It was a person learning to listen to what the earth was saying through their skin. "How long does it hold at this temperature?" Daniel asked, his hand still against the wall. "Through February," Vera said. "Into March in a cold year if you have loaded the floor stones correctly." He nodded slowly. His father stood behind him watching, and Kern's face in the lamplight held something Vera had not seen on it before. It was not pride. It was closer to recognition, the look of a man watching something arrive that he has been waiting for without knowing exactly what shape it would take. Vera looked at the two of them, father and son, in the same pit she had dug alone in September of 1874, and felt something she did not have a name for. Not satisfaction exactly. Something older than that. The sense that a thing carried alone for a long time had finally found more hands to carry it forward, and that the weight distributed would last longer than it would have under her keeping alone. They built their own version that spring under the south end of their equipment shed, following Vera's dimensions as closely as the different site allowed. Kern wrote to her in June to say the floor stones had gone in without difficulty. He wrote again in November to report that the first temperature readings were holding well. The following February, in a cold snap that came through the middle of the month and lasted 11 days, their cellar held at 38 degrees throughout. They lost nothing. The knowledge traveled from there the way practical knowledge travels in farming communities, not through any formal channel, but through the direct line between a problem and a person who has already solved it. It moved without ceremony, without attribution, without anyone writing it down in a form that would outlast the people who carried it. Fletcher Kern taught it to his sons. His sons used it. Two families who had lost stores in the winter of 1880 came to Vera directly that spring through Kern, and she walked each of them through the construction sequence and the principles behind it and the specific mistakes to avoid. By the middle of the decade, there were 4 working versions of the design in the valley, each adapted to its particular site, each one owing its essential logic to 11 days of September, digging in 1874, and the questions a man and his son brought, written on a piece of paper 6 years later. None of them connected any part of it to Borden Price. Silas Holt made one final attempt in the autumn of 1880, filing a request with the county assessor's office to have the underground structure on Vera's property reclassified as a permanent storage improvement and taxed at the higher corresponding rate. The assessor reviewed the request. Deputy Colby's report from January was in the file noting the structure was a lawfully built root cellar with no violations found. The reclassification request was denied. Holt sold his 200 acres in the summer of 1883 and moved south. Kern heard it from the land agent who handled the transaction. The reason given was financial difficulty. Vera did not ask for details and received none. She heard his name once after that in passing at the county seat, and it meant nothing to her in the way that the names of forces you have already weathered mean nothing when the weather has changed. The pit beneath Vera's woodshed stayed in use for 11 more winters. She improved it twice in the years that followed. The first was an extension of the stone floor by 2 feet on the east side, adding thermal mass she had concluded was marginally insufficient after observing the floor temperature drop a full degree more than she wanted on the coldest nights of that first genuine test. The second was a clay drainage channel cut into the base of the west wall and let out through a small pipe to daylight on the downhill slope below the shed, after a wet spring showed her that even a well-built pit was not invulnerable to subsurface water if the ground conditions shifted enough. Both modifications took less than a week. Both of them addressed specific things she had observed rather than things she had theorized. She had come to understand over the years of working with the pit that the difference between a thing that lasts and a thing that merely survives is the willingness to keep asking what could be better and then answering that question with work rather than with intention. By the late 1880s, what sat beneath that woodshed was the product of 14 years of iterative work by a woman who had started with an idea and a matic and no certainty that it would function. It functioned. Season after season, without negotiation, it functioned. And the ground held its 40 degrees the way ground holds things, without drama, without acknowledgement, without requiring anything from the person who had put it to use. Vera sold the farm in June of 1893 and moved to Rochester, where her niece lived, and where the winters were, if not mild, at least not her responsibility to prepare for alone. She was 52 years old. The farm had given her what it could give, and she had given it what she could give, and the account between them was settled. She did not look back when she drove out of the lane for the last time. She had learned in the years since Nathan's death that looking back at a thing you were finished with served no purpose, that forward attention could not serve better. The 80 acres, the woodshed, the pit 9 feet underground, those things would continue whether she watched them or not. That was the nature of something built to last. The couple who purchased the property were young, from a settlement in Wisconsin, with the particular optimism of people who have not yet experienced what they have bought. Their name was Halstead. They arrived with 2 small children and a wagon full of furniture and a great deal of enthusiasm and very little understanding of what a northern Minnesota winter was prepared to do to people who underestimated it. Their second winter reorganizing the firewood in late November, the husband pulled on what he thought was a loose board and found the leather strap. He pulled it and the hatch came up. He called his wife over. They stood together at the top of the 8 steps, looking down into the stone-walled pit, its sand floor, its moss and canvas ceiling intact and undisturbed, and exactly as Vera had left it the last time she had sealed it before leaving. They wrote to her at her niece's address in Rochester. She wrote back 3 paragraphs. The first explained what it was and how it worked in the same way Owen had explained it to her once, completely, without simplification or embellishment. She gave them the complete account, including the floor stones and the ventilation and the specific things to watch for in a wet summer. The second explained the loading schedule and the seasonal temperature indicators to watch for. The third was shorter than the other two. The Earth remembers summer longer than we do. It takes months to cool. Once you understand that winter stops being the enemy, you are not fighting the cold. You are borrowing what the ground already has. The Halsteads used the pit every winter for 28 years until they were old, and the farm passed to their daughter, a woman named Mabel, who had grown up carrying stores down those 8 steps every September and bringing them back up every January and February when the winter was long and the road out was uncertain. Mabel described the pit to a neighbor once in the 1920s when the neighbor asked why she seemed unconcerned about food storage in a year when the winter had turned particularly unforgiving. "It is the most reliable thing on this property," Mabel said. "More reliable than the furnace, more reliable than the road, more reliable than whatever the almanac tells you in October. My parents used it every year they lived here. I have used it every year of my life. It has never once let us down." The neighbor asked who had built it. "A woman named Caldwell," Mabel said. "She was here before my parents bought the place. She left a letter explaining it. My mother kept the letter for 30 years. The neighbor asked whether the letter was still around. "No," Mabel said, "but I remember what it said." She told him the last paragraph. Word for word, the way you remember something you first heard when you were young enough to carry it through your whole life without it wearing down. The neighbor was quiet for a moment after she finished. "Who taught her that?" he asked. Mabel thought about it. "Her father," she said. That is all the letter mentioned. Just that her father showed her the idea, and she had to work out the rest herself. That is the whole of it. A woman in Ohio who married a man who kept careful records and went north with him to build something honest on 80 acres along a tributary of the Crow-Wing River. A father who pressed his hand flat against a fieldstone wall in a root cellar in 1850 and told her that the earth held summer longer than she might expect. A pit dug in 11 September days in the year of a man's death below a woodshed that looked like nothing more than what it had always been in the corner of a property that a man named Silas Holt spent 4 years trying to take from her and never did. No patent, no diagram, no newspaper account, no historical marker at the edge of the field where she once wheeled the displaced earth out to the low spot and watched the autumn grass grow over it until it disappeared. Just the knowledge itself, handed from a palm pressed against stone in Ohio to a palm pressed against stone in Minnesota to the hands of a young man who had driven 3 miles with a written list of questions, and from there outward through a valley in a generation and onward beyond any record that anyone thought to keep. The cold kept coming the way cold always comes, with no particular interest in the plans of the people living in its path. And below a woodshed in the northeast corner of the Caldwell property, the earth went on holding what it held, the way it had always held, steady and indifferent and completely reliable, giving back what it had been given. Asking nothing, forgetting nothing. The earth does not forget. That was always the point.